A struggling mechanic in Detroit spends his days fixing cars, barely making enough to keep his small garage open. When a young woman arrives in a broken wheelchair, he discovers it's beyond repair. Instead of turning her away, he dedicates weeks to building her a custom wheelchair from spare parts. What he doesn't know is that she's actually a billionaire heiress in disguise, searching for genuine kindness in a world of ulterior motives. Now, as her private jet lands outside his humble garage, both their lives are about to change forever. But will his authentic heart survive in her world of wealth and privilege? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Harrison's Auto Repair sign creaked in the early morning breeze, its faded letters barely visible in the dim light of dawn. Mike Harrison's calloused fingers traced the familiar ridges of his father's wrench, a tool that had passed through 3 generations of mechanics in his family. The weight of it felt right in his hands, like an old friend offering silent encouragement for the day ahead. Inside the garage, fluorescent lights flickered to life, illuminating a space that was more home than workplace. Scattered tools lined the walls, each one telling its own story of cars fixed and problems solved. The concrete floor bore 30 years of oil stains, each mark a testament to honest work and long hours. Mike's morning routine hadn't changed in decades. Coffee from his battered thermos, a quick check of the appointment book, and then the satisfying rumble of rolling up the garage door to greet the day. The neighborhood was still quiet, save for the occasional early morning commuter hurrying past his shop. At 55, Mike's dark hair had started graying at the temples, and laugh lines crinkled around his eyes when he smiled. Those eyes had seen Detroit's glory days and its struggles, but they never lost their spark of determination. He'd learned early on that in this city, survival meant adapting while holding on to your principles. The day's first customer arrived right on schedule, Mrs. Chen's ancient Toyota Corolla making its familiar rattling sound. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," Mike called out, already reaching for the tools he knew he'd need. "How's she running?" "Not good, Mike. That noise is getting worse." Mrs. Chen's worried expression softened as she added, "But I knew you'd know what to do. You always do." Mike smiled, but his heart felt heavy. He knew Mrs. Chen was on a fixed income, and the repairs her car needed were becoming more frequent. He'd been charging her less than his regular rates for years now, something he could barely afford to do anymore. But that's how his father had run the business, people before profits, and Mike wouldn't have it any other way. As he worked on the Corolla, his mind wandered to the stack of bills in his office drawer. The property taxes were due soon, and the new diagnostic computer he'd had to buy last month had eaten into his savings. Modern cars with their complex electronics weren't making things any easier for old-school mechanics like him. "Your timing belt's wearing thin," he explained to Mrs. Chen later, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "I can adjust it today, but it'll need replacing soon." He quoted her a price well below cost, watching as relief washed over her face. The morning wore on, bringing its usual parade of regulars: factory workers with transmission problems, students with temperamental starter motors, and retirees hoping to squeeze a few more miles out of their aging vehicles. Each one got the same honest assessment and fair treatment that had become Mike's trademark. During a rare, quiet moment, he found himself staring at the old family photo hanging in his office. His father stood proud in front of the newly opened garage, a young Mike by his side, both wearing matching grease-stained coveralls. The memory of his father's words echoed in his mind. "Son, anyone can fix a car, but fixing a car while keeping your integrity intact, that's what makes a true mechanic." Those words had guided him through 3 decades of business, through economic downturns and neighborhood changes, through the slow decline of Detroit's auto industry and the harsh realities of running a small business in a changing world. He'd never gotten rich, but he'd earned something more valuable: the trust of his community. A glance at his appointment book showed 2 more slots open for the day. He needed to fill them. The electricity bill wasn't going to pay itself. But as he looked around his shop at the organized chaos that was his life's work, he felt a fierce pride. This place, these tools, this honest way of making a living, it was all his, earned through sweat and determination. The wrench in his hand had belonged to his father, and before that, his grandfather. 3 generations of Harrisons had used it to fix their neighbors' cars, to keep their community mobile, to build a legacy of trust and craftsmanship. Mike set it back in its place of honor on the wall, right next to his own growing collection of well-worn tools. Each one told a story of problems solved, of trust earned, of a life spent mastering a craft that was becoming increasingly rare in a world of disposable everything. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the garage. When Mike first heard it, a rhythmic squeak, squeak, squeak that made his mechanic's ears twitch. He emerged from under Mr. Patterson's Buick to find a young woman in a wheelchair at the entrance of his shop, her face pinched with determination as she struggled with each turn of the wheels. The wheelchair looked as tired as its occupant, an older model that had seen better days. Every movement produced a symphony of protests from its worn bearings and stressed frame. The woman, mid-20s, Mike guessed, wore simple jeans and a plain grey sweater, her brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Can I help you?" Mike asked, wiping his hands on his work cloth as he approached. She looked up, and despite her obvious fatigue, her green eyes sparkled with intelligence and something else, a quiet strength that immediately caught Mike's attention. "I hope so," she said, managing a smile. "I'm Grace, and my chair's been making these awful noises. Someone in town said you can fix anything with wheels." Mike knelt beside the wheelchair, his experienced hands already finding the trouble spots. The frame showed signs of stress, and the bearings were practically grinding themselves to dust. "How long has it been making these sounds?" "A few months," Grace admitted. "It's been getting worse, but I kept putting it off. Couldn't really afford—" She trailed off, a flicker of embarrassment crossing her face. Something about her reminded Mike of the neighborhood kids who used to come by with their broken bicycles, trying to be brave about equipment they couldn't replace. He gestured to a clear space near his workbench. "Mind if I take a closer look?" Grace shook her head, and Mike helped maneuver her chair into better light. As he examined the wheelchair more closely, his concern grew. The problems weren't just superficial. The frame had hairline cracks in critical areas, and several key components were dangerously worn. "I don't want to alarm you," he began carefully, "but this chair isn't just squeaking. It's got some serious structural issues. Have you had any other mechanics look at it?" Grace's fingers twisted in her lap. "3, she said quietly. "They all said the same thing, that it needs to be replaced. But a new wheelchair?" She shook her head. "I've been saving, but between rent and medical bills." Mike stood up slowly, his knees protesting the movement. He'd seen that look before, the mix of hope and resignation that came with knowing a repair was beyond your means. But there was something else about Grace, something in the way she held herself with dignity despite her circumstances that touched a chord in him. The other mechanics were right about one thing. "This chair isn't safe to repair," he said. Grace's shoulders slumped slightly, but before she could respond, Mike continued, "But maybe we could look at another option." Her eyebrows lifted questioningly. Mike found himself walking to his drafting table, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. "I've been fixing things with wheels for 30 years, he explained, beginning to sketch. "Cars, trucks, motorcycles, even built a few custom jobs from scratch. A wheelchair's just another vehicle when you think about it." Grace wheeled closer, interest replacing disappointment on her face. "What are you suggesting? Instead of trying to patch up something that's beyond saving, what if I built you a custom chair?" The idea was taking shape in his mind as he drew. "I've got plenty of spare parts, good materials. Could make something that fits you perfectly. Built to last." "You could do that?" Grace's voice held a mix of hope and skepticism. Mike nodded, adding details to his rough sketch. Won't be quick, probably take a few weeks to do it right. But I could make something better than what you've got now, something that'll really work for you. Grace studied the growing design on the paper, then looked around the garage, taking in the tools, the half-finished projects, the decades of expertise evident in every corner. "Why would you do this?" she asked finally. "You don't even know me." Mike set down his pencil and met her gaze. "My father used to say that any mechanic can fix a machine, but a good mechanic fixes the problem. Your problem isn't just a squeaky wheelchair. It's needing a reliable way to move through the world. I can help with that." A moment of silence passed between them, filled only with the distant sounds of traffic and the quiet hum of the garages. Fluorescent lights. Then Grace smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "I think your father was a wise man, Mr. Harrison." "Mike," he corrected, returning to his sketch. "Just call me Mike." Long after Grace had left the shop, Mike sat at his workbench, surrounded by scattered sketches drawn on the backs of old receipts and repair orders. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across his designs, each one a different attempt at solving the puzzle before him. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten in the rush of inspiration that had seized him. "You're crazy, you know that?" Joey, his part-time helper, leaned against the doorframe. The young mechanic had watched Mike's obsession grow throughout the evening. "Building a custom wheelchair? That's not exactly an oil change, boss." Mike barely looked up from his latest drawing. "I've built more complicated things." "Yeah, but those things paid the bills." Joey picked up one of the sketches, studying it. "Speaking of which, how much are you charging for this?" The question made Mike pause. He hadn't even discussed payment with Grace. The look in her eyes when she mentioned medical bills and rent had told him enough. "I'll figure something out," he said finally. Joey shook his head. "The property tax is due next month, and that new diagnostic computer ain't paid for yet." "I know." Mike ran a hand through his graying hair. The stack of bills in his desk drawer seemed to grow heavier with each passing month. But every time he thought about backing out, he remembered Grace's quiet dignity, the way she tried to hide her disappointment when he first said her chair couldn't be repaired. After Joey left for the night, Mike pulled out his father's old ledger. The leather-bound book held decades of business records, but more importantly, it contained notes about special projects, custom jobs his father had taken on over the years. Some had been profitable, others had been labors of love, but each one had taught him something valuable. He found himself turning to the last entry his father had made just weeks before his passing. It was a repair job for a retired factory worker who couldn't afford to fix his delivery van, the van he used to support his family by delivering newspapers. Instead of turning him away, Mike's father had worked out a payment plan that probably lost money in the end. But at the bottom of the page, in his father's careful handwriting, was a note. "Sometimes the only payment worth having is knowing you did right by someone." Mike closed the ledger and walked to his storage area, where years of collecting spare parts had created a treasure trove of possibilities. A-grade aluminum tubing that could form a lightweight frame, premium bearings from a motorcycle project that never materialized, memory foam padding left over from a custom car interior. Each piece represented an investment he'd made, thinking it would be used for something else. Now they seemed to be waiting for a different purpose. He spent the next hour taking inventory, making lists, calculating measurements. The more he planned, the more certain he became that he could do this, not just build a wheelchair, but create something exceptional, something that would give Grace the freedom and dignity she deserved. The sound of his phone ringing startled him from his calculations. It was his sister Karen, calling for their weekly check-in. "You're still at the shop?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "It's past 9, Mike." "Lost track of time," he admitted, sketching another design variation. "Got an interesting project." He told her about Grace and the wheelchair, about his plans to build something custom. Karen listened quietly, then sighed in that way that meant she was worried about him. "You're doing it again," she said softly, "taking on someone else's problems, just like Dad used to. Is that such a bad thing?" "It is when you can barely. Keep the garage open as it is." A pause. "I know you want to help, but you have to think about yourself sometimes too." Mike looked around his shop, at the tools his father had left him, at the walls that held 30 years of his own history, at the sketches that represented a future he couldn't quite see yet. "Maybe helping is thinking about myself," he said, finally. "Maybe it's about remembering why I became a mechanic in the first place." After hanging up, Mike returned to his workbench. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began drawing again, this time with renewed purpose. The wheelchair in his mind was taking shape, lightweight but sturdy, comfortable yet maneuverable, built not just for function but for dignity. On the corner of the paper he wrote a single word: commitment, because that's what this was, a commitment to something larger than himself, to the kind of mechanic and man he wanted to be. Tomorrow he would start gathering materials. Tomorrow he would begin building something that might change someone's life. For tonight, he had decided, and sometimes that was the hardest part of any journey. The first piece of the wheelchair frame lay on Mike's workbench, freshly bent aluminum tubing gleaming under the shop lights. He ran his fingers along the curve, checking for imperfections. 3 attempts it had taken to get this piece right. The angle had to be perfect, the bend smooth and consistent. Behind him, Grace watched from her deteriorating chair, fascination evident in her expression. "Is that going to be the main support?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. "Part of it," Mike replied, holding the piece up so she could see better. "This'll help distribute your weight evenly, make it more comfortable for long periods." Grace had been coming to the shop every other day for the past week, initially just to check on progress, but increasingly to participate in the building process. Mike found himself looking forward to her visits, enjoying the way her quick mind grasped mechanical concepts. "The whole frame needs to be light but strong," he explained, reaching for his measuring tape, "like a high-end bicycle frame, but with different stress points." He paused, glancing at her. "Mind if I take some measurements?" Grace nodded, and Mike carefully measured various angles while she was seated. He'd noticed she had a slight lean to one side, probably from years of compensating for an improperly fitted chair. He made a note to adjust for that. "You know," Grace said, watching him work, "most people don't put this much thought into it. The last few chairs I've had were just standard models." Mike shook his head, marking another measurement. "Standard doesn't mean right. Everybody's different. Chair should fit you, not the other way around." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the scratch of Mike's pencil on paper and the distant sounds of traffic outside. Through the open garage door, afternoon sunlight painted long shadows across the floor, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of Mrs. Chen's flowering cherry tree from next door. "Joey!" Mike called out suddenly. His young assistant appeared from behind a car he'd been working on. "Can you grab the memory foam from the storage room? The good stuff from that Cadillac project." As Joey disappeared into the back, Grace raised an eyebrow. "Memory foam? That sounds expensive." "I had it lying around," Mike said casually, though they both knew it was a lie. "No point saving it for something else when it can be useful now." Joey returned with the foam, and Mike began explaining his plans for the custom seat cushion. Grace listened intently, asking smart questions about pressure distribution and support. There was something in her questions that occasionally made Mike wonder. They were too technical, too precise for someone who claimed to know little about wheelchair design. The afternoon wore on, and more of the local community began dropping. The first was old Pete, a retired engineer who'd been coming to Mike's shop for decades. He studied the frame design with professional interest, offering suggestions about stress points and material fatigue. Then came Maria from the bakery next door, bringing fresh coffee and pastries for the builders, as she put it, whole neighborhoods. Getting invested in this project, Grace observed, accepting a still-warm cinnamon roll from Maria's basket. Mike smiled, watching as Pete and Joey debated the merits of different welding techniques. "That's Detroit for you. We look out for our own. And am I one of your own now?" Grace asked softly, something unreadable in her expression. Before Mike could answer, a sharp crack echoed through the shop. Everyone turned to see Grace's current wheelchair had finally given way. A support strut had snapped clean through, leaving her precariously balanced. Mike moved quickly, stabilizing the chair before it could collapse further. His heart pounded at how close Grace had come to being hurt. "That's it," he said firmly. "We need to speed this up. You can't keep using this chair." "I don't have another option," Grace started, but Mike was already shaking his head. "Yes, you do," he turned to Joey. "Cancel my regular appointments for the next week. This just became priority one." "Mike, you can't," Grace began. "Already decided." He met her eyes steadily. "Sometimes you have to know when something can't wait." The rest of the afternoon turned into an impromptu workshop. Pete stayed to help with calculations. Maria ran for additional supplies, and even Joey worked late without complaint. As the sun began to set, the frame was taking real shape. Clean, lines of aluminum and steel coming together to form something both beautiful and functional. Grace watched it all with bright eyes, occasionally brushing away what might have been tears. "Why are you all doing this?" she asked during a quiet moment. Mike paused in his work, considering her question. "Because everyone deserves a chair. That feels like it was made just for them," he said finally. "Because sometimes the world needs reminding that we can still build beautiful things together." The answer seemed to touch something deep in Grace. She looked around the shop, at the people working together, at the chair slowly taking shape, and smiled in a way that made her whole face glow. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, we can." It was during one of their afternoon work sessions that Mike first noticed Grace's watch. She'd reached out to touch a piece of the frame, and her sleeve had pulled back just enough to reveal it, a seemingly simple timepiece that nonetheless caught his experienced eye. After 30 years of working on precision machinery, he could spot quality craftsmanship anywhere. The watch looked deliberately understated, but its movement was flawless. Mike had once repaired luxury cars whose entire dashboards probably cost less than that watch. Yet Grace wore it like it was nothing special, just as she wore her plain clothes and carried herself with that peculiar mix of humility and unconscious grace. "Beautiful piece," he commented casually, nodding toward the watch. Grace's hand moved instinctively to cover it, a fleeting expression of concern crossing her face. "Oh, this? It was a gift," she said quickly, too quickly. Mike pretended not to notice her reaction, returning his attention to the wheelchair frame. But his mind was turning over other details he'd observed over the past weeks. Her perfect posture, despite the uncomfortable chair, the way she spoke about engineering principles with hidden expertise, how she never seemed worried about her phone's battery life despite spending hours at the shop. Later that afternoon, Grace excused herself to take a call, wheeling to the far corner of the parking lot. Through the garage door, Mike could see her speaking with an intensity that transformed her entire demeanor. Her gestures became more precise, authoritative, like someone used to giving directions rather than receiving them. Joey appeared at his shoulder, wiping grease from his hands. "Ever notice how she never mentions what she does for work?" "Not our business," Mike replied, though he'd wondered the same thing. "And that phone she's got, latest model, worth more than my car." Joey shook his head. "Something doesn't add up, boss." Mike turned back to his work, but the thoughts kept nagging at him. He'd seen Grace calculate complex measurements in her head, discuss material stress tolerances like an engineer, and demonstrate an understanding of physics that went well beyond casual knowledge. Yet she maintained the story of barely being able to afford basic repairs. The next day, Grace left her small backpack behind when she went to the restroom. A crisp business card had fallen out, landing face down on the floor. Mike picked it up, intending to return it, but caught a glimpse of an embossed logo, one he recognized from news stories about major tech companies. He placed it back exactly as he'd found it, his suspicions growing. But every time doubts crept, Mike remembered the genuine emotion in Grace's eyes when she watched the wheelchair taking shape. The way she connected with every person in the shop, remembered their names, their stories, how she never treated anyone with anything less than genuine respect. Whatever secrets Grace was keeping, Mike decided they didn't change the essential truth he saw in her character. And maybe that was the real test, not just building a wheelchair, but building trust, one piece at a time. Still, he couldn't help but notice how Grace's supposedly simple phone never ran out of battery, how her inexpensive shoes were actually handcrafted Italian leather, how she occasionally used words that belonged more in a corporate boardroom than a Detroit garage. That evening, after Grace had left, Mike found himself staring at the nearly completed wheelchair frame. He'd poured everything he knew into its design, using techniques and materials that would normally be reserved for high-end custom vehicles. If Grace was who he suspected she might be, she could probably have bought a dozen top-of-the-line wheelchairs without blinking. Yet she came back every day, spent hours in his dusty garage, shared meals with his makeshift family of customers and colleagues. Either this was an elaborate deception, or perhaps she was looking for something that couldn't be bought at any price. Mike ran his hand along the smooth curve of the frame, feeling the perfection of the welds beneath his fingertips. Tomorrow, they would start on the final assembly. Whatever Grace's truth turned out to be, he would make sure this chair was worthy of the trust she'd placed in him. The security cameras were so well hidden that even Mike's trained eye had missed them. Tiny lenses nestled in nearby buildings, on telephone poles, even in parked cars that rotated daily, all focusing on his garage. If he had known, he might have understood why Grace occasionally forgot valuable items in his shop. It started with the phone. Her supposedly simple smartphone left casually on the workbench one evening. Mike had simply placed it in a drawer, for safekeeping, letting her know when she returned the next day. Then came a designer handbag, accidentally left behind the counter. Again, he'd secured it without a second thought. What Mike couldn't see was Grace's team watching every movement through those hidden cameras, documenting his unwavering honesty. In a secured room miles away, professionals analyzed his every action, every conversation, building a comprehensive profile of his character. He didn't even open the phone, one analyst noted, reviewing the footage. Or Google the bag's price tag, another added. Most people at least look it up. Grace sat in her custom office chair, ironically, far less comfortable than the one Mike was building, watching the feeds. Her assistant, Thomas, stood nearby, tablet in hand. "The background check is complete," Thomas reported. Michael Harrison, 30 years running his father's garage, perfect credit despite financial struggles, multiple community service awards. No red flags. Grace nodded, but her eyes were fixed on a different screen, one showing Mike working late into the night on her wheelchair, his dedication evident in every careful measurement and precise weld. "He's the real deal," she said softly. Back at the garage, Mike was oblivious to the surveillance, focused entirely on his work. The wheelchair was nearly complete now, each component a testament to his craftsmanship. Grace watched him adjust. A bearing housing, his movements precise despite his fatigue. "You should go home," she said. "It's past 9. Mike shook his head, checking the alignment again. "Want to get this right." Grace wheeled closer, studying his work. The bearing housing was a custom design, something he'd created specifically to make her chair smoother, more responsive. She understood the engineering behind it, far better than she could admit, and knew he'd gone far beyond what was necessary. "Why put so much extra effort into these details?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Most people wouldn't notice the difference." Mike paused, considering her question. "You'd notice," he said finally. "Maybe not consciously, but every time you moved, every turn you made, you'd feel it. That matters." In her earpiece, hidden by her hair, Grace heard Thomas's voice. "Final test ready when you are." She took a deep breath, then deliberately knocked her expensive watch off her wrist. It clattered beneath a workbench, sliding into shadow. "Oh, no," she exclaimed. The concern in her voice only partially acted. "Could you help me find it?" Mike was already on his knees, flashlight in hand. He located the watch quickly, and Grace held her breath, watching through the cameras as he examined it. She knew he'd recognize its true value. A timepiece worth more than his annual income. But Mike simply dusted it off carefully and handed it back. "Looks like it survived the fall," he said with a smile. "Better be more careful with family heirlooms." Grace's throat tightened. She hadn't mentioned it being a family piece. He'd created that story for her, giving her an explanation that would preserve her dignity rather than question her circumstances. In her ear, Thomas was speaking. "All tests completed successfully. Shall I begin final preparations?" Grace muted her earpiece, watching Mike return to his work. He was humming softly, an old Motown tune, as he made minute adjustments to her chair's mechanisms. In that moment, she realized that while her team had been testing him, he'd been teaching her something far more valuable about the true meaning of integrity. "You know," she said, breaking the comfortable silence, "my father used to say you can judge a person's character by how they treat things that don't belong to them." Mike looked up, his eyes meeting hers. Something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of one. "Your father sounds like a wise man," he said quietly. Grace smiled, touching her watch. He was, and for the first time since this elaborate test began, she felt a twinge of guilt about her deception. Because tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, the private jet would land, and Mike Harrison's life would never be the same. The completed wheelchair stood in the center of Mike's garage, catching the early morning light. It was beautiful, not in the showy way of expensive medical equipment, but with the quiet elegance of something crafted with love. Every curve of the frame, every carefully chosen component, spoke of the hours of thought and care that had gone into its creation. Mike circled it one last time, checking each connection, testing every moving part. He'd stayed up most of the night making final adjustments, wanting everything to be perfect for Grace's arrival. The customized seat cushion, shaped to her exact measurements, was covered in soft, durable fabric. The wheels were perfectly balanced, their bearings so smooth, they seemed to spin forever with the slightest touch. "It's not just a wheelchair," Joey said, standing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. "It's a work of art." Mike accepted one of the coffees, his tired eyes never leaving the chair. "Think she'll like it?" "Like it? Boss, I've seen luxury. Cars with less attention to detail." Joey ran a hand along the frame. "This thing's got more love in it than most marriages." The bell over the door chimed, and both men turned to see Grace entering the shop. She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening at the sight of the completed chair. For a long moment, she said nothing, just staring at what Mike had created. Is that really mine?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Mike moved to her side. "Want to try it out?" Grace nodded, seemingly unable to find more words. With practiced care, Mike helped her transfer from her old chair to the new one. The moment she settled into the seat, her expression changed. Surprise, then wonder, then something deeper. "The balance is perfect," she breathed, making a small experimental turn. The chair responded to her lightest touch, moving as if it could read her thoughts. "And the seat, memory foam core with adaptive support," Mike explained, "should prevent the lean you've developed on your right side. Give it a real test. Try some tight turns." Grace wheeled to the far end of the garage, then spun the chair, in a graceful pivot that would have been impossible in her old one. Her laugh of pure joy echoed off the walls. It's like it's part of me." Mike watched her testing the chair's capabilities, his heart swelling with pride, and something else, something he wasn't quite ready to name. She moved through the space with increasing confidence, each motion smoother than the last. "The frame's titanium alloy," he explained as she returned to them. "Lighter than your old one, but stronger, And see these. He pointed to several subtle adjustments built into the design. You can fine-tune everything as you get used to it. Make it grow with you. Grace ran her hands along the armrests, feeling the perfectly smooth transitions, the ergonomic curves that matched her arms exactly. How did you know? She asked softly. About the pressure points, the balance issues, everything. Watched how you moved, listened to what you didn't say. Mike shrugged. A good mechanic reads the machine, a great one reads the person. Tears welled in Grace's eyes. She reached for Mike's hand, squeezing it tightly. Thank you, she whispered. Not just for the chair, but for seeing me, really seeing me. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Then Joey cleared his throat. I'll just, go check on that Chevy in the back, he said, making a tactful exit. Grace wiped her eyes, then made another circuit of the garage, testing the chair's responsiveness at different speeds. You know, she said finally, I've had chairs that cost more than this whole garage, but none of them ever felt like this. Mike noticed her slip, mentioning expensive chairs she supposedly couldn't afford, but said nothing. Whatever her secrets, they didn't matter. What mattered was the joy in her movements, the way she held herself with new confidence. Mike? Grace's voice had grown serious. There's something I need to tell you, something important. But before she could continue, a sound cut through the morning quiet, the distinctive whine of jet engines, far too close to be normal airport traffic. Grace's expression shifted, becoming both resigned and determined. Actually, she said, as the sound grew louder, I think it might be better if I show you. Mike moved to the garage door, looking up at the sound. His eyes widened as a sleek private jet descended toward the empty lot next to his garage, its gleaming surface reflecting the morning sun like a mirror. Grace, he turned back to her, questions flooding his mind. She sat straighter in her new chair, suddenly looking both more vulnerable and more regal than he'd ever seen her. Remember when you said a good mechanic reads the person? She took a deep breath. Well, now it's time for you to read the whole story. The private jet touched down with impossible precision on the empty lot beside Mike's garage, its engines sending small whirlwinds of dust across the cracked concrete. It was sleek and modern, its pearl-white surface emblazoned with the familiar tech company logo that Mike had seen countless times on his computer screen. I believe, Grace said quietly, that I owe you an explanation. Before Mike could respond, the jet's door opened and a small entourage emerged. Leading them was a tall man in an impeccable suit, tablet in hand, moving with the purposeful stride of someone used to making things happen. Ms. Wheeler, he called out, everything is prepared. Mike's mind caught on the formal address. In all their time together, he'd never heard anyone call Grace by her last name. Now, watching her respond to it with natural authority, pieces started falling into place. Thank you, Thomas, Grace replied, her voice carrying a new weight. She turned to Mike, who stood frozen in the garage doorway. I'm not exactly who I pretended to be. Grace Wheeler, Mike said slowly, the name finally registering. As in Wheeler Technologies? The company that's revolutionizing adaptive medical devices. She nodded, wheeling forward in the chair he'd built her. Founder and CEO, though I prefer just Grace, especially from friends. The entourage had reached them now. Thomas, 2 security personnel, and a woman carrying what looked like legal documents. They formed a respectful semicircle around Grace, but she kept her eyes on Mike. The wheelchair wasn't just broken, she continued. I was testing something. Testing people, actually. Trying to find someone who could see beyond surface appearances. Beyond dollar signs and corporate titles. Joey appeared from the back of the garage, his jaw dropping at the scene before him. Boss, he managed, there's a jet in our parking lot. I know, Joey, Mike replied quietly, his eyes still on Grace. I see it. Grace wheeled closer to Mike, her movement in the new chair so smooth it seemed like floating. Every major medical equipment manufacturer in the country has tried to partner with us. They all sent corporate proposals, profit projections, marketing plans, but none of them understood what I was really looking for. She gestured to the chair she sat in. This is what I was looking for. Someone who could see the person behind the problem. Someone who cared more about getting it right than getting it profitable. Thomas stepped forward, extending a thick envelope toward Mike. The standard non-disclosure agreements and preliminary partnership proposals, Ms. Wheeler. But Grace waved him back. Not yet, Thomas. She looked up at Mike, her expression softening. First, I need to know something. Are you angry with me for the deception? Mike took a long moment before answering, looking from the jet to the wheelchair he'd built, to the woman he thought he'd known. The chair, he said finally. Was any of that real? Did you really need it? Every word was true, Grace replied, earnestly. My regular chair was genuinely failing, and everything I told you about my condition, my needs, it was all real. The only thing I hid was my ability to pay for it. Mike nodded slowly, then walked over to his workbench. From a drawer, he pulled out a small notebook filled with measurements, sketches, and observations about Grace's movements and needs. He held it up. Then this is what matters. Not the jet, not the company. This was always about building the right chair for you. The rest, he gestured to the entourage, the contracts, the corporate trappings. That's just details. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. And that, she said, turning to her team, is exactly why we're here. She spun her chair in a graceful circle, demonstrating its responsiveness. Look at what he created. Not because it was profitable, but because it was right. Imagine what we could do together, bringing this level of care and craftsmanship to people who really need it. Mike looked around his humble garage, at the tools his father had left him, at Joey's stunned expression, at the life he'd built over 30 years of honest work. And what exactly are you proposing? Grace's eyes sparkled with the same excitement he'd seen when she'd first sat in the new chair. How would you like to help me change the world, one wheelchair at a time? Word spread through the neighborhood with the speed of summer lightning. By noon, a small crowd had gathered at the edges of the lot, watching the gleaming private jet with a mixture of awe and concern. Mrs. Chen stood at the front of her bakery, wringing her hands. Old Pete had called his entire family. Even the local news van had shown up, kept at bay only by Grace's discreet security team. Inside the garage, Mike sat at his workbench, staring at the business card Grace had handed him. Wheeler Technologies. He read aloud, his finger tracing the embossed silver letters. World leaders in adaptive technology innovation. That's the corporate line, Grace said, still seated in the wheelchair he'd built. I prefer to think of us as problem solvers, just on a larger scale. Joey paced the garage, occasionally glancing at the jet through the window. This is crazy, boss. Like, actually crazy. Do you know what Wheeler Tech's market value is? I try not to think about it, Grace answered for Mike, a hint of her earlier shyness returning. Numbers like that stop feeling real after a while. Thomas cleared his throat politely, tablet still in hand. Ms. Wheeler, the board is expecting an update on the initiative. Tell them I found exactly what we've been looking for. She didn't take her eyes off Mike. If he's interested, of course. Mike stood up slowly, walking to the wheelchair he'd created. He ran his hand along the frame, feeling the smooth welds, the perfect curves. What exactly would this partnership mean? We want to bring your approach to wheelchair design to a larger market, Grace explained. Not mass production. That's what everyone else does. We want to create a new division focused on custom-built, personally fitted chairs. Your designs, your standards, just with our resources behind them. And my garage? Mike asked quietly. My customers? Keep it exactly as it is, Grace replied immediately. That's essential to what makes your work special. We'd build a small production facility nearby, bring in apprentices for you to train. But this place, she gestured around the garage, this stays your sanctuary. Joey let out a low whistle. Boss, do you know what an opportunity like this? I know, Joey. Mike cut him off gently. He turned to Grace. "Can I ask you something?" "Not Grace Wheeler, the CEO, just Grace." She nodded, recognizing the tone in his voice. "All those hours we spent working on this chair, talking about life, sharing stories, was any of that real? Or was it all part of the test?" The garage fell silent. Even Thomas stopped tapping on his tablet. Grace wheeled closer to Mike, her expression completely open. "The first day, when I came in with the broken wheelchair, that was planned. Everything after." She shook her head. "I kept coming back because for the first time in years, someone saw me as just Grace. Not an heiress, not a CEO, not a disability success story. Just someone who needed help and wanted to understand how things worked." Mike nodded slowly, then reached for his father's old ledger. He opened it to the last page, where he'd been keeping track of hours spent on Grace's chair. "You know," he said, "I never did give you a bill for all this work." Grace laughed, the sound breaking the tension in the room. "I think we can work something out." "Ms. Wheeler," Thomas interjected, "the media's getting rather insistent outside. We should consider making a statement." Grace looked at Mike. "That's another thing you should know. Once this goes public, everything changes. Your quiet life, this garage, there will be attention." Mike walked to the garage door, looking out at the gathering crowd. He saw Mrs. Chen passing out pastries to waiting reporters, old Pete regaling anyone who would listen with stories about the wheelchair's construction, neighborhood kids taking selfies with the jet in the background. His community, already adapting, already making the story their own. "Maybe change isn't so bad," he said finally, turning back to Grace. "As long as we're changing things for the better." Grace's smile was radiant. "Is that a yes?" Mike reached for a clean rag to wipe the grease from his hands, a gesture he'd performed thousands of times over the years. But this time it felt different, like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. "You know what my father used to say about opportunities?" he asked, returning to Grace's side. "He said they're a lot like engine troubles. It's not about whether you get them. It's about what you do with them when they show up." Inside Mike's small office, Grace's legal team had set up an impromptu presentation. The old coffee-stained desk where Mike usually did his bookkeeping now held a sleek laptop displaying a PowerPoint deck with Wheeler Technologies' signature blue and silver logo. "The initial investment would be substantial," Thomas explained, scrolling through financial projections that made Mike's head spin. "We're looking at a state-of-the-art facility within 5 miles of your current location. You'd have complete oversight of quality control and training." Mike leaned back in his creaky office chair, trying to process the numbers on the screen. They had more zeros than his garage had seen in 30 years of operation. "And my current customers?" he asked, returning to his primary concern. Grace wheeled forward, her new chair moving silently across the worn linoleum. "That's actually a key part of the plan. Your garage stays exactly as it is, serving the community, maintaining your personal connection with clients. It becomes our research and development hub, where we learn what people really need." She spun her chair in a smooth circle, demonstrating its responsiveness. "This wheelchair? It's perfect, because you took the time to understand how I move, how I live. That's what's missing from mass-produced medical equipment. That's what we want to bring to a broader market." Thomas cleared his throat. "The licensing agreement for your designs alone would provide significant—" "Thomas," Grace interrupted gently, "could you give us a moment?" Her assistant nodded, gathering his materials and stepping out. Through the office window, Mike could see Joey showing some of Grace's engineers the custom tools he'd developed for the wheelchair construction. "Can I tell you something?" Grace asked once they were alone. "Something not in the PowerPoint?" Mike nodded, noticing how she unconsciously adjusted her position in the chair, small movements that proved how well it fit her. "When I was first injured," she continued, "everything was about numbers, insurance forms, medical bills, rehabilitation schedules. Even the wheelchair they gave me felt like it had been designed by spreadsheet. No one asked what I needed to feel like myself again." She reached out, touching the arm of the chair Mike had built. But this feels like it was designed by someone who cared about the answer to that question. Mike thought about all the small modifications he'd made throughout the building process, each one based on something he'd observed about how Grace moved, what made her comfortable, what gave her confidence. "The thing is," he said slowly, "I can't build every chair personally. Not if we're talking about helping more people." "No," Grace agreed, "but you can teach others to see what you see. To understand that every person who needs a wheelchair has their own story, their own needs." She smiled. "We're not looking for a production line. We're looking for a revolution in how adaptive equipment is designed." Mike stood up, walking to the window. Next door, Mrs. Chen was organizing an impromptu celebration, setting up tables with pastries and coffee for the growing crowd of neighbors and reporters. The community that had supported his garage for 3 decades was already embracing this new chapter. "My father used to say that tools are only as good as the hearts of the people using them," he said finally. "All these resources you're offering, the facility, the engineers, the funding, they're just tools. What matters is how we use them." Grace's eyes lit up. "Exactly. That's exactly what I've been trying to explain to my board for months. We don't need another manufacturing company. We need a place where craftsmanship meets compassion." She pulled a folder from her bag, opening it to reveal hand-drawn sketches. Her own designs, Mike realized, done during her hours in his garage. "I've been thinking about how to scale your approach without losing its soul. Small teams, each led by a master craftsperson, apprenticeship programs, direct relationships with clients." Mike picked up one of the sketches, recognizing elements of his own design philosophy merged with innovations he'd never imagined. "You've put a lot of thought into this." "I had a good teacher," Grace replied softly, "someone who showed me that the best solutions come from really seeing the person behind the problem." From outside came the sound of laughter and conversation, as more neighbors arrived, drawn by the extraordinary scene of a private jet parked beside the familiar old garage. The future was arriving at breakneck speed, but somehow it felt right. Mike turned back to Grace. "I have conditions," he said. She straightened in her chair, suddenly every inch the CEO. "Name them." The Wheeler Technologies boardroom bore little resemblance to Mike's garage. 60 stories above Detroit, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view that made the city look like a model train set. The conference table alone probably cost more than his annual revenue. Mike tugged at the collar of his new suit, a gift from Grace that he'd initially resisted. "Your ideas deserve to be heard," she'd insisted. "The suit just helps them listen." Now, standing before the board of directors, he understood what she meant. "Mr. Harrison," the chairman began, "Ms. Wheeler tells us you have some conditions for this partnership." Mike glanced at Grace, who sat at the head of the table in the wheelchair he'd built. She gave him an encouraging nod, the same way he'd nodded to Joey when teaching him a particularly tricky welding technique. "3 conditions," Mike said, his voice steady. "First, the garage stays as is. No corporate makeover, no fancy sign, just honest work at fair prices." He unrolled a set of blueprints on the table, his own drawings, done on the same paper he used for car repair estimates. "Second, the new facility gets built here." He pointed to a location in his neighborhood, where the old factory used to be. "That land's been empty for 20 years. The community deserves this investment." One of the board members frowned. "That area's hardly ideal for a cutting-edge facility." "It's perfect," Grace cut in. "Skilled workforce, existing infrastructure, and a community that understands the value of building things right." She smiled at Mike. "Your third condition?" Mike pulled out his father's old ledger. "Every chair we make gets a story, not just measurements and specifications, who it's for, how they'll use it, what matters to them. Just like you did with me, Grace. Every client gets time to be known." "Understood." The boardroom fell silent. These titans of industry, used to discussing market shares and profit margins, found themselves confronted with something entirely different. a philosophy that put human connection at the center of manufacturing. Do you have any idea how inefficient that would be? One director asked. The time investment alone is exactly why our chairs will be different, Grace interrupted. She wheeled around the table, the smooth movement of her custom chair making its own argument. Look at this wheelchair. Really look at it. It's not just engineering, it's understanding. That's what our customers need. Mike watched her take. Command of the room. Seeing both the CEO and the woman who'd spent hours in his garage, sharing stories and insights. In her, the two worlds were already merging. The chairman cleared his throat. Ms. Wheeler has made it clear that this initiative is a priority. Mr. Harrison, assuming we accept your conditions, how soon could you begin training staff? Already started, Mike replied, thinking of Joey's eager face as he learned the fundamentals of adaptive equipment design. But we do it right. Small teams, proper apprenticeships, quality over quantity. Like a guild, Grace added, her eyes shining. A modern guild of wheelchair craftsmen. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from skepticism to consideration. Mike recognized the look. He'd seen it countless times when showing customers that sometimes the best solution wasn't the most obvious one. After the meeting, Grace found Mike standing at the windows, looking down at his city. His garage was barely visible from this height, but he could make out the lot where the jet had landed, now transformed into a hub of activity as preliminary surveys for the new facility began. You did well in there, she said, joining him at the window. They're not used to being challenged, but they needed to hear it. Mike smiled. Reminds me of explaining to a customer why the quick fix isn't always the right fix. He turned to her. Your board members aren't so different from my regulars. They just wear fancier suits. Grace laughed, the sound echoing in the empty boardroom. That's exactly why this is going to work. You see people, Mike, not positions or bank accounts or disabilities, just people. Outside, the sun was setting, over Detroit, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In its light, the old industrial city looked both ancient and new, a place where past and future were finding ways to coexist. It's a good view, Mike said quietly, but I think I prefer the one from my garage. You can see people's faces from there. Grace reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. Then that's where we'll do the real work. This, she gestured at the boardroom. This is just the wrapper. The heart of what we're building is down there in your garage, in the community. Mike nodded, feeling the smooth calluses on Grace's palm, evidence of her own hard work, her own journey. Two worlds meeting, not colliding. Together, he said simply. Together, she agreed. The threat arrived on expensive letterhead, delivered by courier to Mike's garage. Meditech Corporation, one of the largest manufacturers of medical equipment in the country, was claiming patent infringement on 3 critical components of his wheelchair design. They're trying to shut us down before we even start, Thomas explained, spreading documents across Mike's workbench. Standard corporate intimidation tactics. Mike studied the diagrams attached to the letter, his expression darkening. These aren't my designs. The bearing assembly they're claiming. It's completely different from what I developed. Grace wheeled back and forth across the garage, her chair's smooth movement a testament to the uniqueness of Mike's work. They know that. This isn't about patents. It's about fear. We're disrupting their market. Ms. Wheeler, Thomas interjected, our legal team recommends... No, Mike's voice was firm. We don't need lawyers yet. What we need is to show them the difference. He picked up his father's old ledger, now filled with new designs. Grace, remember what you said about every chair having a story? She nodded, watching as he began pulling out photographs, clients in their custom wheelchairs, each one unique, each one perfectly adapted to its user. Meditech makes products, Mike continued. We're making solutions. Let me prove it. Next morning, Mike walked into Meditech's corporate headquarters, carrying a large presentation case. Grace had offered to come with him, but he'd asked to handle this alone. Some things, he'd said, need a mechanic's touch. Richard Davidson, Meditech's CEO, kept him waiting for 45 minutes. When Mike finally entered the executive office, Davidson barely looked up from his desk. "Mr. Harrison, our lawyers are handling this matter. I'm not sure what you hope to accomplish." Mike set his case on Davidson's desk. "Just want to show you something." Mechanic to businessman. He opened the case, revealing the bearing assembly Meditech claimed he'd copied. Beside it, he placed his own design. "Look closely," Mike said. "Really look." Davidson frowned, but leaned forward. The differences were immediately apparent. Mike's design was elegant in its simplicity, yet far more sophisticated in its function. "This is your patent," Mike explained, pointing to Meditech's component. "Good design, solid, but it's one size fits all." He picked up his own creation. This adapts to the user, changes as they change, grows as they grow. "That's not possible," Davidson started, but Mike was already pulling out more components, laying them side by side with Meditech's standard parts. "Every piece I design has a person's name attached to it. A story, a reason." Mike's voice carried the same patience he used when explaining complex repairs to customers. "You're not suing me because I copied you. You're suing me because I found a better way." Davidson sat back, studying Mike with new interest. "You realize what your partnership with Wheeler Technologies means? The market disruption." "I realize. There are people who need chairs built for them, not for a production line." Mike began packing up his components. "Your lawyers can keep sending letters, but I'd rather offer you something else." "Oh," Davidson's eyebrow raised. "Collaboration, your manufacturing expertise, our custom approach. Instead of fighting over the past, we could build something new." Mike smiled slightly. "Grace, Ms. Wheeler, told me to say synergistic market optimization here, but I prefer plain talk. We both want to help people. We're just coming at it from different directions." The room fell silent as Davidson considered the proposal. Finally, he pressed his intercom. "Cancel my next appointment and get Wheeler Technologies on the line." He looked at Mike with grudging respect. "I think we have some discussing to do." Later that evening, back in his garage, Mike recounted the meeting to Grace. She shook her head in amazement. "You turned a patent lawsuit into a collaboration just by showing them the actual work." Mike shrugged, returning to the wheelchair. "He was currently building. People understand honest work, Grace, even when they've forgotten how to do it themselves." She watched him measure and adjust, his hands sure and steady. "You know, most people would have let the lawyers handle it." "Most people," Mike replied, "haven't spent 30 years learning that the best way to fix something is to understand it first." "Local mechanic and billionaire CEO revolutionize wheelchair design." The headline blazed across Mike's morning paper. Below it, a photo showed him and Grace in his garage, both focused on a wheelchair design sketch, their heads bent together. In concentration, the story had exploded overnight. What began as local news had gone viral, capturing imaginations across the country. A blue-collar mechanic and a tech billionaire joining forces to transform an industry. It was the kind of story people desperately wanted to believe in. "Good Morning America wants an interview," Thomas announced, juggling 3 phones as he entered the garage. "So does the Today Show, Ellen, and every major news outlet in the country." Mike continued working on his current project, a chair for a local teenager with cerebral palsy. "Tell them I'm busy," he said, measuring a curve. With practiced precision, "Mike," Grace wheeled over, holding up her tablet to show him social media reactions. "People need to hear this story. Look at these comments. Parents of disabled children, veterans, elderly people. They're all saying the same thing. Finally, someone understands." He paused, reading some of the messages. They were heartfelt, desperate in some cases. People sharing their struggles with ill-fitting equipment, their frustration with one-size-fits-all solutions. "It's not about us anymore," Grace said softly. "It's about them, about hope." Later that week, they did their first interview together, right in the garage. Mike had insisted on the location. "You want to tell our story?" he'd said. "This is where it happened." The interviewer, a respected journalist from a national network, watched as Mike demonstrated his fitting process with a new client. "What made you decide to build custom wheelchairs?" she asked. Mike glanced at Grace, who smiled encouragingly. "I didn't decide to build wheelchairs," he answered. "I decided to help someone. The rest just followed." The story aired on Sunday night. By Monday morning, Wheeler Technologies' stock had jumped 20 points, and Mike's garage had a waiting list hundreds of names long. "We need to scale up faster," Grace's board insisted during an emergency meeting. "The market is ready. We can't waste this momentum." But Grace held firm. "We do this right," she said, echoing Mike's words. "Every chair gets its story. Every client gets heard." The media attention brought other changes too. Tourists started appearing in the neighborhood, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous garage. Investors circled like hawks, trying to get in on what they saw as the next big thing. Through it all, Mike kept working. Each morning, he opened his garage at the same time, wore the same oil-stained coveralls, gave each project the same careful attention he always had. "How do you stay so grounded?" Grace asked him one evening, after another day of media chaos. The garage was quiet now, just the two of them and the comfortable sounds of Mike's tools. "My father used to say that fame is like a powerful engine," Mike replied, making a minor adjustment to her chair's bearings. "It can drive you forward, but if you don't know where you're going, it'll just drive you crazy." Grace laughed, then grew serious. "The media keeps trying to make this into a fairy tale. The poor mechanic and the rich CEO. They want some grand romance." Mike's hands stilled on the wrench. They hadn't discussed this aspect of the publicity, though they'd both seen the speculation, the suggestive headlines. "Does it bother you?" he asked quietly. "What they're saying?" Grace wheeled closer until she was right beside him at the workbench. "What bothers me," she said, "is that they think it's about money. Rich, poor, that's not what matters. What matters is this." She gestured to the garage, to the chairs in various stages of completion, to the dream they were building together. "And what is this?" Mike asked, his voice soft. "This is two people who see the world the same way, who understand that real value isn't in bank accounts or headlines." She took his hand, grease stains and all. "It's in making something that matters." Outside, another news van cruised by slowly. But inside the garage, in their own world of tools and dreams and honest work, Mike and Grace had found something the media could never quite capture. A partnership forged not by circumstance or publicity, but by shared vision and growing trust. The first sign that something was wrong was the smell. Harsh chemicals cutting through the pre-dawn air. Mike had arrived early, as he always did, only to find his garage door slightly ajar. Inside, devastation awaited. Every surface had been doused with industrial solvent. His tools, many inherited from his father, lay in corroded heaps. The custom wheelchairs in progress were destroyed, their carefully crafted frames warped and damaged beyond repair. But worst of all was his father's ledger, now nothing more than a soggy mass of dissolving paper. "Mike?" Grace's voice came from the doorway. She took in the scene, her face paling. "Oh my God." He stood in the center of his ruined shop, hands clenched at his sides. 30 years of work, 3 generations of tools, irreplaceable designs, all destroyed in a single night of calculated malice. "I've called the police," Thomas reported, already on the scene with Grace's security team. "And our investigators are—" "It was Brunswick Medical," Grace cut in, her voice hard. "Has to be. They were the only ones who knew about the new composite material we were developing." Mike barely heard them. He was looking at the wheelchair he'd been building for Sarah, a 12-year-old with muscular dystrophy. The frame was twisted, the special adjustable features he'd designed specifically for her growing body now useless. "Her fitting was supposed to be today," he said quietly. Grace wheeled to his side, reaching for his hand. "We'll rebuild it. We'll rebuild everything. It's not just the chairs." Mike picked up one of his father's ruined tools, the metal crumbling in his hands. Some things can't be replaced. Police came and went. Insurance adjusters took photos. News crews gathered. Outside, held back by Grace's security. Through it all, Mike moved through his garage like a man in a dream, cataloguing each loss, each destruction. Grace watched him, her heart aching. She'd seen corporate sabotage before, had weathered industrial espionage and hostile takeovers. But this was different. This was personal. "I should have had better security," she said, joining him by his ruined workbench. "After the merger talks with Brunswick broke down, I should have known they'd retaliate." Mike shook his head. "This isn't your fault, Grace." "No." She gestured at the destruction. "They did this because of our partnership, because what we're creating threatens their mass production model." "They did this," Mike said firmly, "because they don't understand what we're really building here." He picked up a damaged bearing assembly, one of his new designs. "They think if they destroy our tools, they destroy our work. But the real work is here." He tapped his temple, "and here." His hand moved to his heart. Grace felt tears threatening. In the midst of losing everything, he was still teaching her. "Mike Harrison." Mrs. Chen's voice cut through the gloom. She stood in the doorway, flanked by old Pete and what looked like off the neighborhood. "You helped me keep my bakery open during the recession. Now it's our turn." One by one, people stepped forward. Old Pete carried his own toolbox. "Been saving these since my engineering days," he said gruffly. Joey arrived with supplies from his uncle's machine shop. Even Sarah's parents came, not to complain about the delayed wheelchair, but to help clean up. "See?" Mike said softly to Grace. "They don't understand what a garage really is. It's not just tools and parts. It's community. It's family." Grace watched as the neighborhood transformed the scene of destruction into one of resurrection. Every ruined tool was catalogued, every damaged design documented. People shared stories of Mike's help over the years, each one a testimony to why this place mattered. "Thomas!" Grace called out. Her assistant appeared instantly. "Contact Brunswick's board. Tell them if they want a war, they've got one. But first..." She looked at Mike, who was showing Joey how to salvage a partially damaged frame. "First, we rebuild, exactly as it was." "Better than it was," Mike corrected, managing a small smile. "After all, we've got something they don't have." "What's that?" He gestured to the people working together, to the community that had rallied around them. "Heart. You can't destroy that with chemicals. You can't sabotage it. You can only make it stronger." Grace felt something shift inside her. The last wall between CEO and woman, between business and emotion, crumbling away. In that moment, watching Mike rise above destruction with grace and wisdom, she realized she was falling in love, not just with the mechanic who had built her perfect wheelchair, but with the man who could teach a tech billionaire about true wealth. The new garage emerged from the ashes of the old one like a phoenix. Where Brunswick had sought to destroy, the community had rebuilt, but with thoughtful improvements. The tools were new, but carefully chosen to match the quality of those lost. The workbenches were rebuilt to better accommodate wheelchair users. Even the lighting was enhanced, though Mike had insisted on keeping one old fluorescent fixture just to remember. But the most significant change wasn't physical. On the wall where Mike's father's old ledger had once sat, a digital scanner now captured every design, every measurement, every client story in real time. The past and future had found their balance. The blueprint approval came through this. "Morning," Grace announced, wheeling into the garage with a tablet displaying the plans for their new manufacturing facility. "Construction starts next week." Mike nodded, adjusting the height of Sarah's rebuilt wheelchair. The young girl would be arriving soon for her final fitting, delayed but not defeated by Brunswick's sabotage. "Brunswick's board called again." Grace continued watching him work. "They're ready to settle. Their CEO's resignation was just the beginning. They're offering a full partnership on our terms." "And what do you think?" Mike asked, though he already knew her answer from the glint in her eye. "I think they learned the hard way that you can't fight heart with hate." She smiled, running her hand along her own chair's perfect curves. Besides, they need us more than we need them. The door chimed, and Sarah wheeled in with her parents. The 12-year-old's face lit up at the sight of her new chair. Mike had rebuilt it even better than the original, incorporating improvements, based on everything he'd learned from the destruction. "Is it really ready?" Sarah asked, barely containing her excitement. Mike gestured to the chair. "Why don't you try it and see?" The transfer from her old chair to the new one was smooth, practiced. The moment Sarah settled in, her expression transformed. The chair responded to her slightest movement, supporting her exactly where she needed it. It's like it knows me," she whispered, executing a perfect spin. "That's because Mr. Harrison took the time to know you," Grace said softly. "That's what makes these chairs special." Sarah's parents watched with tears in their eyes as their daughter moved with newfound freedom and confidence. Mike stepped back, letting Sarah explore her chair's capabilities, but Grace caught the emotion he was trying to hide. "Every chair tells a story," she said, taking his hand, "but some stories change lives." Later, after Sarah and her family had left, Mike and Grace sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset through the garage door. The lot where the new facility would be built was visible from where they sat, its empty expanse full of promise. "You know," Grace said thoughtfully, "Brunswick actually did us a favor." Mike raised an eyebrow. "How do you figure that?" "They thought they were destroying what made us special. Instead, they showed everyone exactly why we're different." She gestured to the garage, to the community that had rallied around them, to the future they were building together. "They showed us what really matters." Mike really looked at her. Gone was any trace of the disguised billionaire who had first entered his shop. In her place was a partner, a visionary who shared his understanding of what it meant to build something that mattered. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about what you said when all this started, about finding someone who could see beyond surface appearances." Grace held her breath, hearing something new in his voice. "I think maybe we both found what we were looking for," he continued. "Just not in the way we expected." Before Grace could respond, Joey burst in, waving a tablet. "Boss, Ms. Wheeler, you need to see this." The tablet showed their story, not the sensationalized version the media had been pushing, but a thoughtful, documentary piece about their work. The camera had captured intimate moments of their wheelchair fittings, the joy on clients' faces, the careful attention to detail that made each chair unique. But more than that, it had captured something else. The way Mike and Grace worked together, moved in sync, finished each other's sentences. The way they looked at each other when the other wasn't watching. "The comments are blowing up," Joey exclaimed. "People are calling it a revolution in adaptive technology. They're saying you two are changing the whole industry." Mike and Grace exchanged glances, sharing a private smile. Let the world think it was about wheelchairs and technology. They knew it was about something much simpler and much more profound. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed to build something extraordinary. The new manufacturing facility rose from the abandoned lot like a promise kept. Its design, like everything else Mike and Grace created together, broke conventional molds. Instead of a traditional factory floor, the space was divided into crafting stations, each one a mini garage where apprentice wheelchair makers could work directly with clients. Mike stood at the entrance, Grace beside him in her chair, both taking in the realization of their shared vision. The morning sun streamed through skylights, illuminating workbenches that matched the one in Mike's garage. Tools were arranged with the same care, the same respect for craftsmanship. "The first training class starts tomorrow," Grace said, watching workers install the final equipment. 20 apprentices, each one recommended by someone whose life was changed by a custom wheelchair. "Including Joey?" Mike asked, though he already knew the answer. "Lead instructor," Grace confirmed with a smile. "He knows your methods better than anyone. Well, almost anyone." They moved through the facility together, their progress tracked by the quiet whir of Grace's perfectly tuned chair. Each station they passed represented a story waiting to happen, a life waiting to be transformed by the perfect wheelchair. "Remember when you thought I was just a struggling mechanic?" Mike asked, pausing at one of the workbenches. Grace laughed. "Remember when you thought I was just another client who couldn't afford repairs?" "We were both right in a way," Mike said thoughtfully. "I was struggling to find purpose beyond just fixing things, and you were a client who needed something money couldn't buy." They reached the heart of the facility, a space designed for collaboration, where designers and clients could work together to create solutions. On the wall hung photographs of their success stories. Sarah performing in her school play, old Pete's grandson competing in wheelchair basketball, countless others living fuller lives because of chairs built just for them. The board meeting went well? Mike asked, though Grace's expression had already told him. "Better than well. The partnership with Brunswick is finalized, but on our terms. They provide distribution and insurance networking, but the design and crafting stay with us," she smiled. "They finally understood that mass production isn't always the answer." Mike nodded, remembering the corporate executives who had visited his garage, watching in amazement as he demonstrated the difference between their standardized products and his custom designs. "Sometimes the most expensive thing you can do is try to save money by cutting corners." "Speaking of expenses," Grace said, her tone shifting slightly, "there's something I need to show you." She led him to what looked like a regular office door. Inside, however, was something extraordinary, a perfect recreation of his father's garage, exactly as it had been before the sabotage. Every tool, every worn surface, even the old coffee maker in the corner. "How did you—" Mike started, emotion catching in his throat. Security cameras caught everything on video before the attack. Plus I had Thomas take detailed photographs when we first started working together. Grace wheeled to the center of the space. "This isn't meant to replace your working garage. This is for remembering, for teaching, for showing future generations what it means to build something with heart." Mike walked slowly around the room, touching familiar tools, breathing in the carefully recreated atmosphere. "You did all this for me." Grace reached for his hand. "I did it for us, for what we believe in, for what we're building together." She paused, gathering courage, "and not just the business." Mike turned to her, seeing in her eyes the same certainty he felt in his heart. "Grace, let me finish," she said softly. "When I came to your garage that first day, I was looking for someone who could see past appearances, someone who understood that true value isn't about price tags or profit margins." She squeezed his hand. "I found so much more than that. I found you. The morning sun painted patterns through the windows, just like it did in the original garage. In this perfect replica of where their story began, they found themselves at the beginning of something new." "You know," Mike said, his voice gentle, "my father used to say that the strongest bonds are forged by people who build things together." Grace smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "And what do you say?" Mike knelt beside her chair, the chair that had started everything, that had brought them together, that had changed both their lives. "I say, sometimes the best things we build aren't things at all." The kiss, when it came, felt like the final piece of a perfectly crafted design falling into place. Behind them, through the windows of their new facility, the sun rose fully over Detroit, promising another day of building dreams, changing lives, and proving that the strongest foundations are built on understanding, trust, and love. 1 year later, Mike stood in his original garage, now transformed into something that was both exactly the same and completely different. The tools were still arranged with precise care, the coffee maker still dripped in the corner, and the familiar sounds of mechanical work filled the air. But now a small plaque hung beside the door, Harrison Wheeler Foundation, where every chair tells a story. The foundation's logo, A simple wheel with a heart at its center had become a symbol of hope across the country. Each month, hundreds of custom wheelchairs were crafted in their facility, each one telling its own story of transformation. But Mike still worked here in his original garage, taking on special cases and teaching new apprentices the art of seeing beyond the obvious. "Ready for today's fitting?" Grace asked, wheeling in from their office next door. Her engagement ring caught the morning light, a simple band with a small gear worked into the design, as unique as the chairs they built. "Sarah's here for her annual adjustment," Mike replied, smiling. "Can't believe how much she's grown." The teenage girl who entered was hardly recognizable as the timid 12-year-old from a year ago. She moved with confidence in her chair, which had been repeatedly adjusted to accommodate her growth and changing needs. Behind her came a younger girl, looking nervous in her standard hospital wheelchair. "This is Emma," Sarah announced. "I told her you could help her like you helped me." Mike knelt beside Emma's chair, his experienced eyes already noting the ways it failed to serve her properly. But more importantly, he saw her, really saw her, the way he'd learned to see every client who came through his door. "Well, Emma," he said gently, "why don't you tell me your story?" Grace watched from nearby, her heart full. On the wall behind them hung photographs of their journey. The original wheelchair she'd arrived in, the jet landing outside the garage, the community rallying after the sabotage, the opening of their facility. But more meaningful were the photos of lives changed, clients receiving their custom chairs, apprentices graduating from their program, families celebrating newfound freedom and mobility. The Harrison Wheeler approach had revolutionized adaptive equipment design. Their methods were being taught in engineering schools, their philosophy of personal connection reshaping how the medical industry thought about assistive devices. But here in this garage, it was still about one simple thing: seeing the person behind the problem. As Mike began his careful measurements of Emma's needs, incorporating her dreams and challenges into his design process, Grace thought about how far they'd come. Their love story wasn't just about two people finding each other. It was about finding a shared purpose, about building something larger than themselves. The door chimed again as Joey entered, now the head of training at their facility. "Got room for one more observer?" he asked, gesturing to a young apprentice mechanic behind him. "Figure she should learn from the best." Mike looked up from his work, meeting Grace's eyes across the garage. They shared a smile, recognizing in this moment all the threads of their story coming together. Past and future, tradition and innovation, heart and craft. "You know what my father used to say?" Mike asked, reaching for his design notebook. "He said the best tools in any garage aren't the ones that fix things. They're the ones that help people build better lives." "And what do you say?" Emma asked shyly, already warming to his gentle presence. Mike took Grace's hand, squeezing it gently. "I say that when you build something with love, you're not just fixing what's broken. You're creating something that was missing from the world." Through the open garage door, Detroit's morning sun painted long shadows across the floor, just as it had done that first day when Grace wheeled in. But now those shadows fell across a legacy of love, craft, and transformation. A legacy that would continue to change lives, one story, one chair, one heart at a time.